The U.S. Patriot Act has been probably one of the more controversial laws that's been on the books for a while. But I love the title here, Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act of 2001. If you look at the capital of each of those words, it's USA Patriot Act. But like I said, it's a complex and confusing law that's been renewed several times. Its future is uncertain. But Title I, Enhancing Domestic Security Against Terrorism, establishes a counterterrorism fund. Most importantly, prohibits discrimination against Arab and Muslim Americans and establishes presidential authority. Now, there's a lot of provisions in the USA Patriot Act, and I'm not going to go through each of these, but we'll highlight a couple. Just certainly, if you're interested, you can go through and look at them in much more depth. Enhanced surveillance procedures are under Title II. It's the authority to intercept wire and oral electronic communications relating to terrorism and fraud and abuse offenses. The ability to share criminal investigation information, amends the federal rules of criminal procedures, allows the federal agencies to share information during investigations, and the duration of the FISA surveillance on non-U.S. persons who are acting as agents of a foreign power amends FISA to allow 90 days of warrantless surveillance. Title II also includes seizure of voicemail messages, authority for delaying notice of the execution of a warrant. We'll talk about that in a little bit in this unit. And interception of computer trespasser communications and nationwide service for search warrants for electronic evidence. Very interesting provision, the immunity for compliance with the FISA wiretap. And no cause of action shall lie in any court against any provider of a wire or electronic communication service, landlord, custodian, or other person that furnishes any information, facilities or technical assistance in accordance with a court order or request for emergency assistance under this act. The International Money Laundering Abatement and Anti-Terrorism Funding Act, very important aspect of fighting terrorism is fighting the funding of terrorism. So if you don't know, terrorists finance a lot of their operation through funding activities, either selling oil, drugs, converting legitimate purchases or businesses into money laundering facilities. But money laundering is a very important aspect of the terrorist financing. So there are Title III, therefore, adjusts some of the rules and regulations around money laundering. In fact, tightening up that process. To give you an instance, in working for a payment company for a number of years, one of the things that we had to watch closely was potential money laundering opportunities where a criminal might set up a business and then funnel bad credit card information or stolen credit card information through a phony business for the purposes of converting that into cash. Protecting the border, protecting the northern border, enhanced immigration provisions, and preservation of immigration benefits for victims of terrorism. Removing obstacles to investigating terrorism, using DNA indications of terrorists and other violent offenders. In fact, the use of DNA has become much more prevalent in the investigative world, and there have been a number of criminals who have been caught many years after their original crimes because of DNA collected in some states where for subsequent crimes that they may have committed. Also, from what I understand, it's that some of the DNA tests you may take for genealogical research may in fact be shared with law enforcement. Don't have a citation on that one for you, so take that one with a grain of salt. And then disclosure of educational records. We'll talk about the adjustments to FERPA here in just a second, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. But providing for victims of terrorism, public safety officers, and their families. It provides for aid to families of public safety officers and amendments to the Victims of Crime Act of 1984. Increased information sharing for critical infrastructure protection, strengthening the criminal laws against terrorism. Interesting in Section 802, a definition of domestic terror. In fact, we have down a little bit further here, domestic terrorism, activities that involve acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of the criminal laws of the United States or of any state and appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, and to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping, and occurs primarily within the territorial jurisdiction of the United States. So, luckily, we don't have a great deal of domestic terrorism, but there are provisions for it, and certainly people who are focused inside government law enforcement agencies that are focused on identifying domestic terrorists. Title VII, strengthening the criminal laws against terrorism. And again, you can see in here the definition of the federal crime of terrorism and deterrence and prevention of cyber terrorism. A lot of effort has been focused on the cyber terrorism aspect of terrorism. And it's not an unlikely scenario that we may see terrorists operating in the electronic world as much as they operate in the physical world in the future. And the severability clauses you see this a lot in contracts. Basically, it says that if any provision inside the Patriot Act were found to be unenforceable or invalid, that would not affect any of the other clauses in the Patriot Act. And it's a good way to protect the wholeness of the law or the statute in this case, just as it would protect the contract that you would have with somebody, where you might try to break a contract by saying one certain provision was unenforceable or invalid. In this case, in the case of a contract with a severability clause, that would not invalidate the contract, nor would it invalidate the act here. So the Patriot Act extended some of the statutes that were under other types of electronic crimes laws. So the Federal Education Records and Privacy Act, or FERPA, basically grew out of the anti-war protests for students' records and protection of students' records. Where they wanted transparency and access of the records limited to the individual student themselves. But FERPA recognized a shift from in loco parentis. And in loco parentis means that someone is acting as a parent for the student. So when you're off at college, for instance, even though your parents may be in the same town, while you're on the college campus, the campus acts for your benefit and for your welfare, and therefore it's acting in loco parentis. There were already existing health and safety exceptions for the individual students, but the Patriot Act amended FERPA to permit the educational institutions to disclose educational records to the federal law enforcement officials without student consent. there was a court order, and the institution was not held liable, is not held liable. So one of the important aspects of this is that there is, and certainly you see it in the news occasionally, there is an increase in activity, foreign agents acting as students in college universities. So it's not unlikely that an investigation may revolve around a particular student whose activities may be drawing the attention of federal investigators. FISA Surveillance Act amends the FBI seizure with court orders of certain business records pursuant to an investigation of international terrorism. Prohibits that record keeper from disclosing that FBI action to anybody, and the investigation is not to be conducted upon a U.S. person solely on the basis of activities protected by the First Amendment. The ECPA is amended with updates to provisions covering the telecommunication environment to include electronic information such as voicemail, which is now obtainable like email with a court order, and computer trespass, where the owner-operator consents for federal investigation. When there's a reasonable belief the investigation is relevant to a computer trespass. No authorization is required and no limits are established. And I think this is probably one of the neatest names for a provision: sneak and peek. The USA Patriot Act changes the point at which the target is notified of the search. So prior to the Patriot Act, if there was to be a search, you had to notify the target that search was taking place. Under the Act, the investigator can delay the notification for 90 days and can extend longer with a showing of good cause. But this is limited to cases where there's a danger to life or safety of an individual, where there's flight risk, where there's witness or evidence tampering, or where immediate notification would jeopardize the investigation.